exceptional. Okay. So exceptional thinker and innovator, Dr. David Ellerman is here today with us. David Ellerman has had profound impact across diverse fields, including economics and philosophy. Over the years, he has served as a policy advisor at the World Bank, working in academia, and contributed significantly to the study of economic democracy. His work challenges conventional thinking, encouraging us to explore new framework for understanding workplace governance, and ownership. Today, we have the opportunity to hear David present on the topic that is both timely and transformative: Introduction to Democratic Firms, European ESOP Model. In this lecture, he will explore the principles behind employee ownership, focusing on the European ESOP model, and delve into how democratic companies can shape the future of work. I'm confident that his insights will challenge us and resonate across disciplines. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Ellerman.
Okay, thank you, Miloš and Tina. My talk today is about a specific type of firm, a democratic firm, and sort of what it is in theory. And then we are trying to build specific practical models of it, and so we'll go into that as well. So first of all, I want to just go over the general idea of a democratic firm in analogy with a democratic political system or democratic polity, say a municipality. So wherever you are in Rijeka or Belgrade or so forth, you're in a democratic municipality, and there is no notion of ownership, that you don't have owners of a city that cannot be bought by some Saudi oil sheik. And so it's something where you are a member or a citizen, but it's not itself owned. And the idea of the membership in a democratic firm, same type of thing. You don't have owners, you don't have shares that can be bought and sold. It's the owners, or the members, I should say, are people that have this functional role of working in the firm. And it's the same idea with the democratic municipality, that the voters are based on the role of being a citizen that resides in that municipality. And in a democratic firm, there's no equity shares that can be issued. Membership is determined by working in the firm, not by owning an equity share. And that's the same as in a democratic municipality. There's no such thing as equity shares in Ljubljana, where I am, or where you are. And but you can have debt. You know, municipalities issue bonds or other forms of debt. So it's very different in all these four instances from a conventional corporation. And that's something to bear in mind. So we're going to talk about different mechanisms by which you can transform a conventional firm that is something that's owned, that does have equity shares, that can be bought by anybody with enough money and so forth, how you can transform that older form of a corporation into a democratic firm. And the most developed models we have in the world today of democratic firms are in the Basque region of Spain. This is the Mondragon worker cooperatives, and are fairly famous. And but that's a whole nother talk to go into them. So the mechanism we're going to talk about was developed in the United States back in the 70s by this fellow, Louis Kelso. And the idea, it's a right-wing idea. It's not a left-wing idea. And we get a lot of nonsense about people saying, well, this is like Yugoslav self-management, socialist ownership. And in fact, the idea started at the other end of the spectrum with Kelso. So his books were The Capitalist Manifesto, The New Capitalist, How to Turn 80 Million Workers into Capitalists on Borrowed Money, and so forth. And one of his famous sayings is the only problem with capitalism is not enough capitalists. So the ESOP, or Employee Stock Ownership Plan, started out as a right-wing initiative to turn workers into capitalists, as it were, in their own firms, not as capitalists in the sense of being day traders on the stock market or anything like that. So that's where we started with that institutional development in America. And then how do you modify that or use that in a modified form to create a more democratic firm? And that was not Kelso's intent at all, but that's the history that we're building upon. And here's another right-wing author, Lord Eustace Percy, and gave a speech in 1944 after World War II, and gave a interesting treatment of this whole question of how do you organize production, and with no, he was obviously not a left-winger, he was a conservative, a Tory, but a sort of philosopher thinker. And the quote here is very interesting. Most urgent challenge to the jurist and statesman, the human association in which produces, distributes wealth, association of workmen, managers, and technicians. So this is all the people that work in the firm, is not an association recognized by law at all. The association which the law does recognize is shareholders, creditors, and directors, and this association is incapable of production and is not expected by law to perform these functions. So he puts his finger right on this sort of fundamental contradiction in the way in which production or economic enterprise is organized today, that the people that do the actual work are not even recognized in law, that association of them, and the association that is recognized are people that have no capability to perform the work, shareholders, and so that's what is legally recognized. And Percy says we have to give law to the real association, namely to the people that work in the firm, and withdraw meaningless privilege from the imaginary one. So very, very radical statement from somebody in 1944, but gave an excellent statement of the difference between the conventional firm and the democratic firm. So let's now take a look at this mechanism that we're building upon, the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, or ESOPs, as they were developed in America, and then we'll look at how we modify that in Europe and in other countries to make it more democratic. But the most important point is, when you hear about employee ownership in the general public, people think that's workers buying shares out of their pocket, out of their payroll deductions or something like that, so-called employee share purchase plans, often with the company maybe giving them a discount on the price of the shares or making matching contributions, something like that. That's not what an ESOP is. An ESOP is not an employee share purchase plan. They do not buy shares out of their payroll or out of their pocket. And so it's very different. The idea is, in fact, the shares are purchased out of the future company profits, not out of the payroll. And this is why it is spread so much, because workers, ordinary workers, don't have the money to buy shares. Only the upper white-collar workers or managers might have discretionary income to buy shares. So you never get any sort of a employee ownership across the board, what we call broad-based employee ownership, with share purchase plans. So ESOP is not that. It's everybody's included in the ESOP, all the workers, not just the managers or white-collar workers, and the shares are paid for. You're paying off the other owners, the older owners that are typically retiring, and they're paid for out of the profits. So that's very different. And the ESOP, another important point, that it's not direct employee share ownership. So it's not one of these things where the employees own the shares individually and directly and can sell them to whoever they want, or can bequeath them to their heirs. That's not the idea of an ESOP. An ESOP is a separate legal vehicle, special purpose vehicle, and the share accounts are inside the ESOP. So an ESOP is like a one-way trapdoor. Once the shares get inside the ESOP, they don't leave. They're not sold to anybody on the outside, and employees can in fact not mortgage them and not as collateral. They'll eventually be bought back by the ESOP, and then shares are transferred to the younger workers at that time. We'll talk about that in a bit. But so this is one of the characteristics, this special purpose vehicle to hold the shares. I was, my first encounter with Yugoslavia was back in 1989 and 90, and I started a company in Ljubljana to do worker buyouts. And we tried to get this sort of ESOP legislation passed, and it was defeated by Jeff Sachs and indirectly by the World Bank. And so the law didn't pass. What eventually passed was something like a voucher privatization program. And so a lot of workers bought shares directly. And so you had a lot of employee-owned firms in Slovenia, for example, but the shares were not held in a separate vehicle. And after 20, 30 years, those workers who want to retire, and who are they going to sell their shares to? And so that's one of the problems we're facing now. We're working with companies that started 30 years ago. The older employees are retiring, but the company wants to remain employee-owned. And so we have to figure out this mechanism to set up a separate legal vehicle patterned after the ESOP to buy the shares back. And then once they get inside that, then they turn over by generations. And so it stays employee-owned, and you don't have this problem of workers having individual shares and then wanting to sell out to whoever's the highest bidder. So the fourth point here is all employees are included. That's very important. The idea is not to have just the managers. And some of the companies that we've approached to work with here in Slovenia said, well, I'll start out with shares to the managers or the junior managers or the project leaders or something like that. And we have to say no, that the ESOP, that's not the idea of an ESOP. An ESOP is everybody's included. And so it's not something just for the upper echelon. Now, as I mentioned, it is indirect because the shares are legally owned by the ESOP. The ESOP is a separate legal vehicle itself. So the workers don't directly own the shares. They cannot sell them to anybody else, and they can't bequeath them to their heirs. So it's indirect ownership, but it's individualized. And this is, of course, totally different than the Yugoslav self-management, where you had no individual share ownership, no individual accounts inside the company. And so it's not a collective form of ownership, it's individual share accounts, although legally the owner of registration is, of course, the ESOP itself as a legal corporation. And the last point here is a gradual transition. So we're trying to make these transitions specifically for succession that you have all across Western Europe. You have an enormous succession problem because the kids of the original owner typically don't want to take on the company, and they're not willing or not able. And so how do you continue the existence of your company? And so in America, that's been the primary source of ESOPs, is to answer the succession problem. And this is certainly acute here in Slovenia, I think in other former Yugoslav republics, but also in Western Europe. I mean, you have something like 40,000 companies in Germany that don't have succession plans, small businesses, GmbHs, and no succession plan. And so that is the sort of entry point for this idea, is to go to companies where the owner wants to retire, and this provides him with a viable succession, but it's gradual. So you're not trying to do a buyout all at once, and the owner does not want to transfer 100% ownership right away to the employees of the company, because it might not work, and they're afraid that something might go wrong. So usually it goes over, say, a 5 or 10 year period to go from starting out to majority or 100% ownership. So that's a very practical thing. And as I said, it's excellent for the small, medium-sized enterprise succession problem. That's a problem throughout Western Europe, but specifically here in the former Yugoslav republics, where you had all these private companies that started in the 1990s, and the owners are now retiring. So let's go into some of the more detailed pictures. So this EOC stands for employee-owned cooperative, because in our specific form of it, we've replaced the trust, the employee ownership trust, by a cooperative. I'll say more about that later, but that's the special purpose vehicle. Here's the seller of the shares up here, and here's the company down here. So the idea is that the seller agrees to sell over time, or, I mean, you transfer all the shares at once, but agrees to be paid over time. So the seller is providing, in effect, the credit for the transaction, and the ESOP writes a note, a IOU, to the seller, says, we will pay you over 5 years or 8 years or whatever it is, this amount, but the shares transfer all at once to the ESOP. So it's like as if it's like a loan, it's a note, and the seller himself is giving the credit. We can also talk about cases where an outside financier will make a loan to the ESOP, and then the seller gets the money all at once. But the more practical and way right now, until the banks get on board, is this sort of seller credit. And the company guarantees the note. So the company says, we will guarantee that we'll make contributions of money to the ESOP in a timely manner, whatever it is, monthly or yearly, to pay off the note. And so that's the guarantee that underwrites the credit transaction. So that's stage one. So the shares are now in the ESOP, but they've not been individualized yet. So the next stage here is where the cash payments are made from the company to the ESOP. So these are payments that are they're deductible from corporate income tax, and they are free of the social called social contribution, in America called Social Security contribution, which is substantial here in Slovenia. So it's free of both those taxes when the legislation is passed, and that money then passes through to pay off the note. And it's only then that the shares are individualized inside the ESOP. So it's as if the workers have to make the money to pay off the note, and only then do they get the ownership of the shares in their individual accounts inside the ESOP. So it's not a gift, it's something they have to earn over a period of time, 5 years, 8 years, or whatever it is. So so you have the initial transaction, you have the period in which they're paying off the note, and then the third stage here is where the note is paid off, and then the company starts then to buy back from the employee members. You have replaced here the seller now by the employee members. So they don't have to wait until retirement. This is a major difference from the American ESOP, which is a pension plan. The European ESOP that we're building is something where after the note is paid off, then you can start to buy out the oldest shares. So the shares that go into these individual accounts have dates on them. And so you use the first in, first out system. The oldest shares get bought back first, and then they are recycled. This arrow here means they're recycled to all the accounts of the people still working there. So some of them may get recycled to the individual workers that had the oldest shares. That doesn't matter. The point is you're slowly transferring the assets of the company from the older generation to the younger generation over time. And workers are getting cash long before retirement, which is a major difference with the American ESOP I'll get to in a moment. But those are basically the three stages: the initial setup, payment of the note, and then what's called the rollover or the recycling share plan, where the older shares are bought back and then recycled with the current date. And then when they become the older shares and they are recycled and so forth. So it's a continuous operation. Now, let's compare the American ESOP and what I just described to you, the European ESOP that we're building here in Slovenia and elsewhere. So the ESOPs in America have actually been, they were legislated in the mid-1970s. So you've had almost a half century or so of experience. So there are now about 6,500 ESOPs in America, but the more interesting statistic is 10% of the private workforce work in ESOPs. So on the average, 1 out of every 10 workers is a part owner of their company. Now, some of those shares may be minuscule, some of them may be 100%. So because you have ESOP, all variety of ESOPs. Some are in large publicly traded companies, so they're only a small percentage of the ownership, but at least you have 500 or 600 of them that are 100% owned by the ESOP. Now, one of the major problems with the American and the US ESOP is that it's a trust. And a trust is something that is set up legally when you don't trust someone. So like when a kid inherits money and you don't just give the money to the kid, you put it into a trust. And when the kid grows up and becomes of age, then they get the money. So the ESOP is set up as a trust. And so the ESOP is actually run by a trustee, ultimately, somebody who works in the trust department of a bank, and it doesn't expire, unlike the normal trust for kids that grow up. It never expires, and so the employees are treated like they're permanent children. So this is just straight class prejudice by the Kelso and company that set up these laws, that the workers cannot be trusted with ownership, and so they have to be treated like permanent children. And so we have taken that part out. In the European ESOP is not a trust; it's a worker cooperative or an association that where the workers hold the shares in this special purpose vehicle outside of the company. And the ones we've done here in Slovenia, it's a worker cooperative. In other countries, you might have forms of economic association that would be appropriate for this vehicle. But in all these cases, it's not a trust. It's a separate organization that is democratically controlled. Obviously, in a co-op, it's one person, one vote, and so forth. Number two here, the American ESOP was legislated as if it were, well, as a pension plan. And the idea is that, see, in America, you have private, or you had, there are not that many these days, but you had private pension plans. So big companies like General Motors or Chrysler would have a pension plan that was a private pension plan, and they were for their workers, and they were forbidden to invest more than a small amount in the actual company shares because they wanted it to be diversified. So the ESOP was legislated by a carve out of that legislation saying, well, there's a special type of pension plan called an ESOP where it can invest 100%. In fact, it should invest 100% in the shares of the underlying company. So that was an artifact of the way the ESOP was legislated and is not part of the idea at all. And the problem is, of course, that you get, employees in their 20s or so wanting to, buy an apartment, buy a car or something. And they say, well, you're an owner now. And when you retire, you'll see some cash, a lot of cash. And that doesn't help them much because they can't take out a mortgage based on that expectation. So that's been one of the big problems in the American ESOP is employees don't see any cash until they get near retirement. And that's a problem that my colleagues in America are working on various ways to try to get around that, to try to do something that we built in from the beginning, this share recycling or rollover plan. So workers see some money from their ownership long before they retire. So the European ESOP is not a pension plan, and the share recycling or rollover is the way in which they can get some cash out of their ownership. And it's usually after the seller note is paid off. If they're doing really well, they maybe can start the rollover earlier. But the priority, of course, is to pay off the seller note, and then you can start doing the rollover. So what are the benefits here? So first of all, the ESOP anchors the company in the community. So this is something that's very important in certainly here, and I think in a lot of Western Europe, you have companies started all over the place, not all in the metropole, not all in the big city. And how do those communities that live off those wages and taxes of those businesses, how do they keep those companies in the community? And the ESOP does it automatically because the owners then are the workers that live in that community, so it anchors the capital there. So the alternative, now we're going into all the alternatives in the succession problem. So these are the different types of sales. So one type of sale that the owner could make is to a competitor. And well, first of all, they don't like to do that psychologically because these are the guys they've been competing with all the time. But more importantly, the competitor doesn't want to run two companies. So once he buys your company, he's going to slowly transfer the business over to his main operation. He's going to transfer the customer list, maybe some top people, the technology, and then run down as you transfer the business over to the main company, the jobs will slowly be lost and all the time depreciating, taking depreciation on the company that he bought to cover the profits in his main business. So if you sell to a competitor, you may get more money because competitors are willing to pay more because they're doing away with some competition. They're becoming more monopolistic in the marketplace, but the company will be gone in, say, 5 or 8 years as all the businesses shifted over to their main operation. So it doesn't anchor the company in the community. It sets up a situation for it slowly to be wound down. Sell to private equity. Private equity is a big deal. Now in America, it's coming to Europe. It's fairly big in Germany. Already it's trying to make its inroads into Slovenia now and probably other parts of former Yugoslavia. And private equity basically wants to milk or rape, choose your language, the company to get back the money it invested to buy the company and to make a good profit. And just to give you an example, in America, the minimum of any investment in a private equity fund is $500,000, and the otherwise the minimum investment is more typical is $6 million. So you have to have $6 million to invest in a private equity fund, and then it goes out and buys these companies and milks them to get a good return. And what's left behind is just a shell of a company that may collapse and then be resold. So they've milked it to get what they want, and then they dispose of it. And a lot of the big names of companies in America have just been raped like this and no longer exist. Toys R Us or Sears and Roebuck and so forth are all examples. And this happened in Slovenia. The Slovenia no longer has a national airline. It was Adria Airways was the Slovene airline, and it was bought by a private equity firm in Germany, and I think registered in Luxembourg. And so they, one of the tricks they do is to get their money back quickly by selling the assets to their friends and then leasing it back. So they sold all the airplanes to some cronies and then had Adria lease them back, so they no longer own the airplanes that they had before. And the money that was obtained from selling the airplanes, the private equity company used to pay off the debt. And so now Adria was having to pay rent, leasing payments where it didn't have to before because it owned the planes. And they even sold the name and leased back the name. And Adria could not, the profit margins were not sufficient, and so it collapsed. And so that's why Slovenia no longer has an airline. So that's the sort of thing that private equity does. And so that's two alternatives to ESOP: selling to competitors, selling to private equity. And third alternative is selling to some big company or purely financial fund that makes investments and unlike private equity, doesn't try to run the company directly. And what usually happens then is that it says, well, at least in Slovenia, Slovene workers are not cheap, and very good benefits and social contribution is something like 22%, so forth. So once we get the ownership of the company, let's move it to Bosnia or Bulgaria or wherever, and make more profits. So that's what tends to happen there. So once again, the company is not anchored in the community and gets moved. This drama is being played out right now with a Slovene company called Alpina, which makes hiking boots or skiing boots, and is fairly well known. And it's being played out in a small town called Zri, which has about 2,000 inhabitants. And there's another company in that town, which we're working with, called Etiqueta, which makes labels on everything. And so Etiqueta is doing an ESOP to maintain the employee ownership, which they had before from the 1990s, and to stay in the community, whereas Alpina was bought by a Czech financial fund, and they're now moving everything to Bosnia. So so these are the alternatives, and the other alternative of transferring it to your kids when they grow up isn't done very much these days. So ESOPs is really one of the few alternatives facing a company as a practical thing to account for succession. And if you look at it now from the point of view of the seller, this is what preserves your legacy. Because if you put yourself in the shoes of some founder of a company, that's their main accomplishment in their life, is to build up this company with the help of the employees, of course. And they don't want it to be raped or moved or whatever else. That's their legacy. And one of my colleagues in America that has a company that sets up ESOPs. He was describing his conversations with owners, because owners have these various options. And he says, when I'm talking to the owners and when I hear the word legacy, then I know I'm in the right church. And that sort of expression saying, now I'm talking to somebody that has the value to maintain his legacy. He's not just after the most money, so then he can go wherever he wants to preserve his legacy. So that's one of the things that's done by an ESOP. Rewards the employees, will help build up the company, which is also important value in some owners. And in the prior to this succession moment, ESOPs typically improve employee retention. This is something that's important in the IT business. You have a lot of opportunities for highly skilled workers to go to other companies. And but if the longer you stay, you get more shares, because you're getting shares every year in either in paying off the acquisition debt or in the rollover plan. You get shares the longer you stay. When you leave, your account is closed and paid off. So just to give you another anecdote, there's a company in the northern part of Croatia called ETAS, and it's been employee owned for a long time, and it's had a lot of economic difficulties and so forth. But they told me that when they got some younger workers coming into the firm, and they said, oh, this is an employee-owned company, and you stay here, you'll get shares in the company. The young people said, no, we don't want shares. And he said, what do you mean you don't want shares? It's nonsense. They said, no, we want to go to Europe. That we want to make some money and go to Europe. But if we get shares, we won't want to go to Europe anymore. And so there was a stark realization that ESOPs do give you better employee retention, because they just wanted to make some money and take off and get out of Croatia and go to Europe. So that's tells you something about the retention aspect of ESOPs. And of course, we have a lot of high-tech companies. That's a big deal, because you always have, they're bidding on people from other companies trying to get your best engineers. And so a lot of the companies we deal with now are high-tech companies that want to emphasize this retention. Another aspect of employee ownership is everybody's on the same page. It's you don't have the usual split between employees and owners, and this is important, that everybody is sort of pulling in the same direction, and that's why we get consistently better economic results with employee-owned companies than we do with conventional companies, where you have that tension between the owners and the employees. So the idea is it's a company of owners that more productive and resilient. The statistics during the COVID recession were that employee-owned firms had much better resilience during the COVID, because they're more flexible. They're not going to demand the same pay package and so forth, because it's their company. And if they have to take some less during that time to survive, then they are, and so they'll do that, and because they're it's not money in owners' pockets and money in their pocket, so it's more resilient in that sense. And the statistics in the COVID period said that. And lastly, the point is that it's automatically more responsible environmentally. People don't want to pollute their own community, and so story there is, give you an example, is there was a Texas oil man who was doing fracking in the Dakotas in America, in North Dakota or South Dakota. Fracking is a controversial way to get out oil, and it sometimes pollutes the underground water aquifers and so forth. But he was a Texas man and making money off doing fracking in the Dakotas. Then along came another oil company that started set up to do oil, get oil by fracking near his Texas ranch. And so who do you think formed and headed up the committee to stop the fracking near his ranch? Well, it was the very same person. So he didn't want to pollute his own ranch, but didn't mind polluting people in North Dakota or South Dakota. So with employee ownership, you get that sort of a social responsibility built in. It's not something that you just write into your company mission statement and so forth. It's built in because you're living in that same community and you don't want to pollute it. So I'm getting to the end here. We have made these changes in the model that we're building here. It's called the European ESOP or co-op ESOP, and developed by your institute. We're now working with a number of sister institutions in Serbia, Germany, France, Croatia, and trying to transfer this our experience in doing this. We have worked so far with what we call pilot projects because we don't have any legislation that has already passed, and so we don't have the tax benefits, we don't have the legal certainty that you would get with legislation, but we have managed to convert a number of companies to employee ownership, and the most exemplary one is called ENEA. You can go to their website, and it's 100% employee owned using this model, about 120 employees there. And this was a company that back in the late 80s spun out of one of the technology institutes here in Ljubljana and was employee owned all along. And so by now, the founding employees have retired, and it was all direct ownership. They didn't have an ESOP, and so they organized, and they wanted to then sell their shares to the highest bidder, try to sell a company to Siemens or something like that, and get the best price. And at the time, there was some, I think 85 or so employees inside, and 65 of them signed a letter, said if you sell the company to anybody else, then the ESOP, we're out of here, we're going. And it was a very real threat because it's not hard to find, if you're a good engineer, to find a job in a high-tech company around Ljubljana. So the outside owners, the previous employee owners, now outside owners, agreed that they would sell to the ESOP. And so that's what happened. And that's why ENEA is now 100% owned. So we have drafted legislation that would give all the tax breaks, that would give legal certainty, that would even include tax clawbacks. So if workers try to capitalize after a few years, sell the company, then they'll have to give back all the tax benefits they've got. So we want it to remain, once it's set up as an ESOP, it will be stay as an ESOP and not be sold out by one set of employees to take away the ownership for the future generation of employees. This legislation has now been approved by the government. The Prime Minister has endorsed it and says he even wants to run on the basis of this in elections coming up next year. And they're now in the process of tax harmonization with all the different aspects of Slovene law. But we expect it to be passed by the government in the first half of this year. And then we will have a lot of companies that will be willing to convert. So that's what we're doing. As I mentioned, we're also trying to transfer the know-how to sister organizations in these other countries. And that's basically my talk. And we can have discussion, questions, whatever you want. Thank you.
Thank you, David. so much for great presentation. I'm sure many of colleagues have questions or comments, so let's open the floor to your thoughts. Who wants to start? Is there any hands? Just to check out. No. Nope. Okay. Okay. Ogden, great.
Yeah, thank you, David, for the great presentation. I've been familiar with your work for a long time, given that I did my PhD research in ETAS actually as an ethnographic study of, so I'm glad you mentioned them as well, even though that's not a fully developed ESOP model, but they are tending in that direction. So I'm glad to hear that you mentioned them. But I did have a question. I mostly wanted you to expand a little bit on the notion of share recycling or rollover that you were mentioning. So is that some sort of a dividend, or does that how does this model of the European ESOP treat company earnings? Basically, that's the question I'm interested in hearing more about. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you need to adjust the whole system of compensation so that the company can, on a more or less continuous basis, make ESOP contributions. It's like what a normal company would call the dividend strategy, to pay out dividends to the shareholders to keep them happy. Here you need to make these periodic cash payments to the ESOP, and in the first period of time, it pays off the acquisition debt, and then after that, it can be devoted to doing the rollover. So the idea is the shares, as you're paying off the debt, the shares will go into the individual accounts. They're distributed between the accounts on the basis of the what is called the distribution key, which is basically salary. So, and salary may be modified a bit by tenure. In ANIA, for example, we suggested salary, and they said, well, we've got a lot of women in the accounting department that have been here forever, but they never get a pay raise. But so let's make the distribution key part salary and part tenure, how long they've been there. In any case, that's how the shares get into the accounts, and they have a date on them. And so when you've paid off the acquisition debt, or you have enough money to spare, you start buying back the oldest shares. So then the workers get cash for those shares, and then they're redistributed to the current workers, including even the ones that are still there who had their old shares bought back, according to the distribution key. So it's why we call it the rollover, recycling. So you're buying, so the workers are getting cash, could be 5 years or 8 years after the ESOP started, and then those shares are recycled to everybody who's currently working. So I don't know what, a lot of people seem to have trouble understanding that, but I've been with us so long, it seems clear to me, but I don't know what. So what part of that is unclear? Put it that way.
I wouldn't say that it was unclear. I just wanted a little bit more information, because maybe the one part that is unclear to me is, let's say I was a worker who was one of the first ones who had these individual accounts of ownership, and my shares over time get kind of amortized. I get some cash. Am I no longer the owner even if I stay with the company, or how does that?
No, the shares are recycled, and some of them can come back to you, but according to your current salary. And you get the cash, and then everybody, the value of those shares is the value of that ESOP contribution, and that's distributed, the value is distributed in terms of bought back shares, all the accounts. And what does change is when you quit or retire, then your account is closed to any new credits, but you still have the shares there that are bought off as they age. And see, the one of the problems I didn't go into is the problem in the American ESOP, where you have an accumulation because they don't pay out the accounts as you go. They get bigger and bigger. And so they like to brag about, well, this worker's got, $200,000 when he's retiring. But the point is that original cohort in the ESOP, if you're paying each one of them $200,000 and they all retire about the same time, you got a problem, a big problem. And so that's a lot of ESOPs, a fair number are being sold out every year because they just cannot meet the repurchase, what's called the repurchase liability that they have to do by law. They have to pay off, it doesn't have to be immediately, but, within 4 to 5 years at least. And so that first cohort, when they're retiring with these big sums accumulated in their accounts, a lot of firms just can't handle that. And so, but with our system, you're continuously doing it. So there's no stochastic element. People are, whether you retire or not, your older shares are going to be bought back. And the only thing that changes, you don't get any new shares if you quit, if you're out. So you don't get any credits to your account, but you get all the old shares bought out. So it's a very regular process. Years ahead of time how much you're going to have to pay off, because years ahead of time what are the older shares coming up. And so it's no longer stochastic based on when people retire. There's no longer accumulation of huge balances you've got to pay out. And so this adds enormously to the sustainability of the ESOP. And in America, unfortunately, you are getting almost the same number of sellouts every year as you get new ESOPs. So the total number of ESOPs in America is basically plateaued. And this is another one of the problems facing the American ESOP that we are trying to address, is this accumulation of repurchase liabilities that forces a sellout. So that's where the recycling plan or rollover comes from. Another problem I might mention is in the American ESOP, managers are allowed to have their own private stock option plans or virtual equity plans or share appreciation rights, all these things outside the ESOP. So see, they're in the ESOP because they're an employee, but then they have these private plans outside because, managers in America get huge salaries and like 300 or 400 times the average worker. And so managers say, well, we need to have this outside. Well, that, of course, creates incentive for the managers to look for buyout offers from somebody who can put all their stock options in the money. And that's what's contributing to it. So we strongly recommend no private outside equity for managers, that everybody's in the same boat. And so it's not that the managers get an equity yacht and the workers get an equity rowboat. They're all in the same boat, and that's the ESOP. And I think those are two major ways that we will contribute to the sustainability of ESOPs: not having the accumulation of repurchase liabilities and not having managers looking at their outside equity saying, well, I'm going to have a lifetime wealth event if I can arrange a buyout of the ESOP and my outside equity.
Okay, we have another question from Neira.
Hi, everybody. I'm a bit of a intruder, probably. I got recommendation by Valentina Otmać to listen, and I'm really grateful. Thank you very much, Professor Ellerman, for this great presentation. ESOP was an idea I was struggling with in Bosnia and Herzegovina because of my background in establishing a microcredit organization with donated equity. So that was the idea was to actually introduce ESOP. And but I have a question. So that was my kind of passion at the time, but I left, so it's not anymore. But the topic is still very hot. My question is, why would ESOP ensure or encourage or disallow, I'm not finding the better word, for example, Adria Airways not to collapse within the market conditions. So I know that I would work harder because I would, but what would ESOP contribute to the market positioning
Well,
of a company not to fail?
Yeah, as you say, it would contribute to productivity and worker retention and all that. But the thing with Adria was that they own the airplanes and they own their name. But with the private equity came in, that became a cost. So they had to lease it back. They were sold and then they had to lease it back. So we had all these cash costs. Excuse me. Cash costs they didn't have before, and that's what they couldn't support. So it wasn't the ESOP itself that would have improved things, but it wasn't just the ESOP itself. It was this what private equity did to them by selling all their assets and then leasing them back. It's the same with real estate. Private equity sells the real estate or the buildings and then has it leased back to the company. So then you have this big cash demand on your company, cash flows, to pay off the lease. And that's why it collapsed.
Okay. So the basic recommendation is once we grow our company, the equity is ours. We have predicted shares within the ESOP, like in the future, but we still keep the ownership of the company in our hands, talking as a potential business owner, and then we don't sell to the private equity. We actually have ESOP and we can protect the company by our productivity, but we can introduce private company in smaller shares, probably. Private equity.
So what's the question?
So if I were to grow the company and my leverage towards that is reaching 7 and I cannot borrow anymore, I do need equity if I want to grow. So the threshold of private equity is probably 20% before they have decision-making power.
Yeah.
And ESOP will help me. I'm just trying to make myself understand it.
Yeah, well,
ESOP will help me raise the productivity, keep the productivity, and make sure that we are surviving in the market.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, so there are many circumstances that companies have where they have to get cash infusions if they want to grow and so forth. And ESOP does not automatically solve that. And so you would, what they're experimenting with in America now. Well, first of all, we have some legislation in Congress that may or may not pass to set up special funds that will make loans to ESOPs because the banks are not necessarily know about it, or the bigger banks do, but your local bank may have no idea what it's all about. And we're doing the same in Slovenia. We're working with the European Investment Bank to set up a fund in Slovenia to be managed by some colleagues, and they would make loans to ESOPs. We already have one case where a farmer cooperative bank has made a loan to ESOP. So it's not that you don't need cash infusions to grow, but there may be new mechanisms that are developed. And that's what's happened at Mondragon. Mondragon has their own bank, and it's been very successful. And they take care of that need. So you try your best not to have private equity come in.
Okay.
And if they do come in, try to make it something where they have a profit kicker, but not a vote.
Okay.
So you have what we call dequity, or a combination of debt and equity, where you basically make a loan, but if your profits are at a certain level, then you get a kicker on top of that, and so all sorts of new mechanisms that may be created.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Peter.
Peter?
Yeah, I want to say thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I wanted to ask a bit about how the character of these enterprises affects the relationship between the kind of labour force and the management. So, I mean, this is obviously going to make, well, the idea is that the kind of the firm or the company is more internally democratic too, because of the structure of the kind of ownership. Would that be correct?
Yeah. Well, one of the big messages of all the research over the last 40 years is that the ownership aspect of ESOP should be accompanied by a change in internal procedures and to make it more participative in all sorts of different ways. And you have a whole literature now developed. Probably the most popular one is what's called open book management by John Case. And I recommend his books, and just called open book management. And it's all sorts of ways in which you change the internal processes at the shop level or office level, so workers get involved. Their ideas are taken seriously, and when they're implemented, or even when they're not implemented, they know they were at least listened to, and so they feel respected, and that helps to build up this atmosphere of a company of owners. So you're all sort of on the same page, and certainly in ANEA, ANEA's is our how do you say, our star company and so forth. Everybody's really on the same page, and the managers are in fact drove the process. I mean, you can't do these things if the managers are against it, and the owners are against it. So managers supported it, and you have a wonderful atmosphere. They're now hiring more people. They're getting more business. They're getting more productive, and but it's not automatic. I mean, you can't say everything's going to be like it before, but now you're an owner. You've got to make it real. You've got to change the way in which your shop or your office is organized, so the people are treated like owners and not just as employees.
Thank you.
I also have one question, if there is no questions anymore. And there are many colleagues here that are from former Yugoslavia, which is well known due to its self-management model that was neither capitalist nor state centralized. And you mentioned that the ESOPs are often wrongly mixed with Yugoslav self-management model because in first ownership is individualized and in later is collective. But my question is why? Can you explain why it's important to have individualized ownership?
Yeah. Well, number of reasons there, but the theoretical one is that the value, the net asset value in a company, is the result of money put in the past, or as the firm grows, its retained earnings, and the retained earnings are earned by people working in the firm, and they could give example Mondragon. Basically, they have the right to what we would call the value added, the revenue minus the non-labor cost. So that include wages plus profits. And they have to make a decision every year as to how much of that to pay out as wages. And those are called anticipations or anticipato. And then what's left at the end of the year, they say, well, how much of that will be paid out as a bonus, or how much will be retained to pay off old debts or to finance new investment. And so that buildup of equity in the firm is money that you could have taken out as your wages in which case it would be your private property. But if you keep it in the firm, in the Yugoslav case, or in the case of the common ownership firms in the UK, for example, it gets socialized, it gets commonized, and you lose it. That's the problem. You're losing the fruits of your labor that you could have taken out, could have been private property. So when you have individualized accounts, then you retain a claim on that, and you get it back eventually in the future. And so what happened in the Yugoslav firms is, of course, that they had a huge bias in favor of debt financing. So debt financing of reinvestment, what we call kicks the can down the road. In other words, it postpones the ultimate payment by maybe beyond your horizon in the firm. And so if I can take out all our earnings as wages and then take out a loan from the local county or government to make investment, that kicks the can down the road, and then maybe I can retire and everything's fine. And so I was here when Slovenia made the conversion, and what had happened is, number one, you had no bankruptcy, so it wasn't a private firm in that sense. That when firms went bankrupt, they were rolled together with some bigger firm, some other firm, and that took away the incentive. In private business, you have an incentive to stay in business, and number two, you got all these soft debts, all this soft budget constraint loans. So I remember when the Slovene government basically nationalized all the firms. They had been so long financed by soft debts that never got paid back, were just rolled over with new debts and so forth, that there was almost no objection, that they were really government owned. And it was a soft form of government ownership where the government, takes care of bankruptcy, takes care of your investment needs and so forth. So in a de facto sense, it was almost government owned. And when it was actually legally made government owned, people didn't go in the streets. If they had, for example, taken ownership of private apartments, then there would have been riots in the streets, and because people paid for that with real money. So the social ownership sort of degenerated over time into some sort of soft form of government ownership, and we don't want that to happen. So we want workers to get the fruits of their labor, and we want them to have incentive. I mean, look at the worker cooperatives around the world. Why are the Mondragon cooperatives so capital intensive, so well developed, as opposed to most other worker co-ops, which are, in very labor intensive businesses? Because the Mondragon co-ops have these internal accounts, internal capital accounts. And that's what, and by the way, the internal accounts in the ESOP don't have to be denominated in shares. They can be denominated in value. And we, in fact, prefer that, to have them denominated in value, not in shares. And unfortunately, so many people are obsessed with shares, delnica, that they want that. But that's not, the Mondragon internal accounts are all denominated in value, and that's much better system. And our law, our draft law allows either way. It's a choice. So, but on this issue of common ownership or social ownership, that's the competing model now in the West to ESOPs, is what's called employee ownership trust. And this was something started in the UK and EOTs. And it's like the ESOP in the sense that the workers are members, all the workers, and the trust pays off the acquisition loan, but there's no internal accounts. It's common ownership. And we predict that it's going to have all the same problems, that it's going to be biased in favor of paying out current income as wages or bonuses, biased in favor of debt financing of all investment. And what's going to happen when this first cohort, I mean, this legislation passed in England in 2014. So what happens 30 years from now when those workers are retiring? You see, the initial set of workers don't get bonuses because they've got to pay off the debt. So they don't, unless they're super profitable, they're not gonna, so they're gonna not even have the bonuses. And so they're gonna be building up this implicit equity and getting no credit for it. And then 20 years, 30 years later, they're gonna go out naked. They're gonna say, we're the ones that, paid off the debt to get this thing worker owned, and we get nothing out of it because there's no internal accounts. And so what are they going to do? Well, they're going to sell the whole thing. That's the only way they can get not go out naked is to sell the whole thing, which is allowed by the legislation. And one of the main thinkers in England about this issue, a guy named Nigel Mason, died recently, warned about this and said, he was head of a advisory company that had done 20 of these EOTs a few years back. And so he did a study of how much they would have got out if they'd had internal accounts when they retire. And he said, even with assuming no appreciation in value, each worker would have got on average 175,000 British pounds, which is like, I don't know, 200,000 or something euros. And instead they get nothing. And so, this idea that somehow you should have social ownership just doesn't add up. The experience is against it. And workers don't get the fruits of their labor. They get socialized and ended up being, in the case of Yugoslavia, essentially government owned. In the case of EOTs in England, I think they'll more and more just be sold out after 20 years or 30 years. And people say, why didn't somebody warn us that? Well, we did. We did. Nigel Mason warned it. We warned it. We've been hammering on this in our publications. But, it's seems very simple. You just don't have to keep track of any accounts. You don't have to pay anybody out early. You don't have to have any accumulation. So everybody goes out naked. Very simple. No, it's not that simple.
Thank you, David. Is there any more questions? No. So, I don't know, Tina, with your permission, maybe we should.
Yes, we can slowly finish this seminar. Once again, I want to thank you all for being here with us, and thank you to Professor David.
Yeah.
It was wonderful, and have a nice day.
Yeah, thank you. It was enjoyable.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Bye-bye.
Bye.